Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Adrian Cox. So Adrian founded Elements Yoga Studio, which is one of the first yoga studios in Bangkok, and it's pretty well known there, Thailand. He has strong NLP background in breathwork, and also in Magik. So Adrian, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to be here.
So I'll start on these interviews by asking people how they got interested in the body. So what was the start of your journey with that?
I wonder how many people would say something to the effect of like that before getting into whichever practice, it seemed like they lived in a bubble and just lived in their head. It's something that I used to say, and then I read somebody describing themselves in exactly the same manner that it seemed like I just existed in a sphere that sat atop this meat caravan or something like that. And I just got into yoga simply because I was curious. I'm curious about everything. And a friend of mine was doing yoga at some center after work. So I went with him. That's just kind of how it started. All I knew was that it's something from India, really. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so place this. Where were you at the time? How did you end up in Bangkok? Give us a bit of a sense of this journey.
Yeah, so let's see. So at that time, I was in Seattle. I was working in computing, and so I got into yoga, but I knew that I loved it, but I wasn't able to quite switch over until a certain place along the way. I faced an addiction problem. That was, 90s in Seattle. So there was a lot of drug use, and So in order to, it reached a certain place where I had discovered that that lifestyle was going towards death, that I decided that
heroin is bad.
Yeah, right. So in my own, I reached a threshold point, as they say, and at that point I decided to really commit to yoga because it seemed like I just knew that it was a source of light for me, and moved to New York. Got a job in New York and started getting into yoga very extensively. Eventually, the time spent in the studio was more than I spent at work, and I took a trip to Thailand, did a Vipassana retreat, had some kind of insight as to the direction that my life was to take. It felt like a grand vision coming to me through meditation. And in that meditation, I saw the yoga school, I saw myself teaching, I saw the faces of some students, and it was at that moment that I decided to quit my job. I went back to New York, and I took a teacher training at Om Yoga with Cindy Lee. That's no longer there. She's still around. I'm not sure where she is, but that was in 1999. And then following that training, I didn't feel like I quite had enough depth in the philosophical side, so I joined the Bihar School of Yoga in India for a while. Then studied in Nepal with a crazy yogi named Dr. Yogi Vikashanand, where we would go up to his roof and every morning and start our practice by dancing to Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up. That was the song every morning in Kathmandu.
You were spiritually rickrolled.
Yeah, it's so surreal that you just kind of have to give into it. When you're dancing at 6 a.m. with a bearded Nepali guy. So what happened? Then I opened this school in Bangkok. It's now what 18 years later. So there's a lot of stuff to fill in the meanwhile. But that's kind of how I ended up here. Now I spend a lot of my time in Japan and kind of commute back and forth. Actually,
Why Japan?
Why Japan? Because my girlfriend's Japanese, and it's a beautiful country, and it's a nice change in term. Bangkok is very disordered. It's very chaotic, and so Japan is kind of the extreme other side of it. It's all aesthetic and order.
But I was in Japan for the first time last year. My wife really loved it. Actually, I had a lot of love for Japan. Bangkok, I've never been to. So is it like a strong yoga scene there? Is it one of these places like Bali or Goa that has a lot of sort of expats, kind of spiritual community? Is that the vibe, or I thought that was Koh Phangan in Thailand?
That is Koh Phangan, but I think that the demographics have changed a little bit in the last few years due to economy and visa regulations and what have you. But Bangkok has always been a hub for expats and for people coming through, working for NGOs, etc. So there is a huge yoga scene. I was initially attracted to Thailand because it's close to India. But it's milder than India. It's a lot easier to live in India. It's also got it has a Sanskrit based language. A lot of the concepts in yoga are familiar to Thais already. So things that like I can repeat from the Yoga Sutra, for example, they know through other means. Yeah, so it made sense in that time to set up here. The culture's changed a little bit since then. I think it's become a bit more well, like anywhere, maybe like the focus has become primarily about the body, as it were. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And okay, great. And you've just renewed your visa for there, right? I just heard as well.
Yeah, there
for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, for a little while longer, anyways. Yeah.
Okay. And tell us more about your approach to yoga then. So it sounds like you've been through a bit of a journey with it. How's it ended up now? Like, what's your sort of unique take on this?
Yeah, so I think in the early days I was very attracted to Ashtanga Vinyasa and hurt my knees, as a lot of people do. Started reconsidering a little bit about how to change. I would describe my way as being more of a technical alignment-based vinyasa. When I teach, I use a lot of NLP in the way that I teach in order to, as I see it, facilitate deeper learning, to encourage people to kind of invest in their practice a little bit more, and also to take the states experience through meditation and the states experience in the state of absorption in the practice, the concentration through that. Yeah. And nowadays I'm working a lot with both breath work, connected breath work via rebirthing, and energy work through ritual magic. So I've combined all these things. Maybe not always in the same setting, but they form the background of how I approach body, mind, emotions, spirit, etc.
I think we can probably spend the rest of the kind of hour opening each of these up a little bit. I know one point of contact we have is the elements. Like just before we started recording, we just started talking about that briefly. You say, what's your kind of inroad into that?
Well, so because like I had mentioned to you that I listened to your podcast, and I was quite happy to hear some new ideas on how to approach the 5 elements of earth, water, fire, air. And did you cover space? I don't think so, right?
I generally use a 4-element model, but I know yoga is normally the sort of Indian 5-element, yeah.
Right, that's how I'm remembering it. So I've had a long interest in ritual magic going back since as a child. And what I have what I've found is a way of working with the elements inside of a ritualized context where the what we're doing essentially and is to use poses that relate to an element. So for example, earth element would be standing poses, feet. There's a way of practicing, like holding poses longer or moving faster, depending on the element. Also different kind of breath practices. And then combining with that visualization, mantra, and I even get into use of associated angelic forms. And now that's a little bit tricky to mention because I don't know if I believe it in a literal sense, but I work with it as an archetype. And then once this state has been thoroughly saturated in the nervous system, I relate to that state through intention. So it's kind of like a law of attraction on steroids, or like prayer, using the body, the breath, the mind, the intention, mantra, and so on. That's a big topic.
Yeah, let's dig into this, Adrian, because I think that when I asked for recommendations for the podcast, and a mutual Facebook friend who's recommended me good people before put you forward, I said, well, what does this guy do? He said, yoga. I said, okay, cool. And he said, magic. And I was like, okay, hang on, what is this? And at that point, I hadn't looked into it at all. And since then, I've just done a couple of small things. I mean, when most people hear the word magic, they're going to think sort of Harry Potter or something like that, right?
Yeah, sure.
So first of all, there's a sort of different spelling and maybe a different meaning. So why don't we go back to what that is to you, this magic with a K?
Magic with a K refers to, it's a way of distinguishing between a magic trick or a specific, highly intentional way of relating to how you would like to move through the world. So essentially, and you know, the forms they're throughout humanity, throughout time. So the specific kind of practices that I enjoy are more from the Kabbalistic or Hebrew side of things, and it's essentially a way of harnessing your attention and your energy in a very intentional way. It's kind of like a martial arts kata, if you will, you know, where you have a memorized set of movements and sounds and visualizations, and at the most basic level, the most literal level, or you know, provable level in a way, is that you could say that a ritual, it gives you this opportunity to really check in with who you are and how you want to be and how you want to move forwards in life. And if you buy into the notion that consciousness is primal, it's, you know, in other words, that consciousness is not simply a byproduct of our neurons generating some thing called consciousness. If you accept that consciousness is universal, then it opens up possibilities that perhaps we can extend our influence beyond ourselves in certain ways that can affect or influence outcomes in our life or influence other people. So it sort of depends on the way that you choose to go with that. I tend to actually be quite practically minded. I mean, I'm very open-minded, and I continue to practice, and I get a lot of benefit in the sense that I went through a lot of very intense stress in the last 3 years or so. I went through a very brutal divorce. And what I found in reconnecting with this practice is that it really allowed me to connect my mind, my emotions, my energy in a way that yoga didn't, or I mean, just pure yoga, at least for me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that.
I mean, so
How's that for a starter?
yeah, more questions than answers, but it certainly, I think, opens the territory up a bit. So working ritualistically, like, give it what might, again, someone might have a picture of a guy in a black robe, standing in a pentagram with a knife covered in blood or something like that, like what might be, or the other image I get when I hear ritual is kind of the sort of Bali kind of hippie version of everyone standing in a circle holding hands. Like what do you mean by like a ritual? Give us a sense of what that is.
Well, apparently, studies show, I'll get to that in a second, but I just wanted to add is apparently studies show that ritual, it has like a conscious ritual. I don't mean like, the ritual of brushing your teeth, right? Or the ritual of turning on Netflix, when you're at home on the couch. A very intentional one. Apparently, the studies show that it can play a very big role in healing, actually. So that's a scientific study. What do I mean? Well, I borrow from a tradition that is essentially, they're drawing on much older traditions. There's one of the primary forms is something called the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. And it's very simple. It takes about maybe 3 minutes, and it's symbolic. So again, it's not that I necessarily believe this in a literal sense, but I find it very useful as a way of engaging my senses. So in this practice, one visualizes energy moving through the body, creates the shape of, they trace pentagrams in 4 directions of the four cardinal directions, and in doing so, claim a space of energy in which there's no outside influences. So it's like you have a small space in your living room or your bedroom where you say, right now in this space, this is my sovereign right to work on myself and on the course of my life as I see it. That's the kind of primary. That's the primary. One of the primary rituals it's very common. It's not. You can find it all over the internet. It's something that when with practice, has it seems to have an effect if you believe in this kind of thing. It seems to have an effect where it clears the aura and clears the mind from being overly drawn to certain concerns that are not within you. Following that, then there's invoking rituals which use a different pentagram that can be used to supposedly invoke an element, right? So that combined with the asana, the pranayamas, the mantras, etc., has given me and the people that I've taught this a kind of an experience of the element. And as you know, or as I would imagine that we are deficient or in excess of different elements depending on our personality, right? And these will show up throughout our lives in a variety of ways, externally and internally. And so certain elements you'll be naturally drawn towards, certain elements you'll find more difficult, like earth is, I don't really relate to it that well. So it kind of helps me and balances my personality to work with earth in that way.
Yeah. Okay, so there's things that make sense to me here and things that don't. So in terms of kind of, I've definitely seen the power of ritualistic kind of ceremony, for example, in terms of clearing people's heads, in terms of helping people make a commitment. We use it on some of our courses in terms of having different amounts of ceremony. There's a way in which being involved in kind of something that you've done, repeatedly, which has a certain significance to you, archetypal kind of significance, can certainly be a kind of powerful psychological, emotional force for people. That makes sense to me. And in terms of focusing one's attention on a particular side of one's being, I look at the 4 elements primarily just as a map, not that each element is sort of somehow, real in some way different from that. But yeah, I can definitely see the sense of sort of that. And I get this kind of traditions that have found ways to do this. I guess where I kind of point of departure for me is this doesn't actually impact the world, though, in any way. Like, I can have a ritual for myself, which kind of changes my headspace, my emotional space, and my embodiment even, but I'm not changing anyone else. And I heard you say earlier, this was a sort of power with the world or other people. Like that for me is a point of departure. I can't do some ritual and then, I don't know, someone falls in love with me or something like that.
Right. So I don't disagree with you. I don't know, to be honest. It basically falls down to one of two positions on how one feels that mind interacts with matter, if it does, right? If it does. So for me, what I have found is that these processes are very powerful in shaping my own state. Yeah. And my own psyche. So that's what I can say with some certainty that using it in this way is a very convincing process on the psyche, because it really involves so much more than just idly making a decision or idly trying to change my viewpoint on something. If I'm engaging my breath and my body and archetypes of, I don't know if angels are real. I have no idea. But when I invest in it, somehow, for some reason, it takes me to kind of a state of being that is, it feels transcendental. So now, again, law of attraction is a little bit of a dirty word. These are tricky. Some people buy it, some people don't. I'm not sure. I've had experiences that things seem to appear, but again, that could be selection bias. So I'm not declaring one side or the other. But I'm saying maybe mind affects matter. Maybe mind can influence the outcome events. Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's kind of an agnostic position almost. That actually makes a lot of sense to me, of like, hey, maybe there's something going on here. Law of attraction is certainly something I find repulsive, if I'm honest. It seems like a sort of childish narcissism to me, where people think they're sort of magically changing the world through their own thoughts. And I also worry about the kind of consequence of that, because it's like, well, if someone's poor, they just didn't want it bad enough. They just visualize it enough. That's why that kid's starving in Africa. So I think it's pretty repulsive moral conclusions that could come from taking on something like law of attraction.
So to nuance that, there's a writer that I like who says, who writes on the kind of the origins of law of attraction, which was actually in the early 20th century, something called the New Thought movement. And the premise of that simply is that thoughts are creative. To put it in a nutshell, thoughts are creative. And what he, as he says, that the primary problem with the law of attraction is that there's no theology of suffering built into it. So it's like what you said, it's nobody deserves to hear that they got cancer because they had the wrong thoughts around it, etc. Keeping that on the table at the same time, while also also opening up the possibility that there could be an effect of thoughts on the world around you, or at least the perception of what you notice, and therefore allowing you to take action in ways that you wouldn't have had you not altered your perception. So that's a conundrum. I keep open-minded though.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me as a position to be sort of open-minded around it, because there's this possibility there, as you say. And working with these archetypal images and qualities, there's definitely something in that. I've had a very strong experience while on a sort of fasting on an intensive meditation retreat of essentially a vision of angels. And I don't want to talk too much about it online because publicly, because it's very personal. And I thought, well, where the hell did this come from? Deep in my sort of childhood is these kind of archetypal Catholic kind of images. I found out they were Jewish as well, actually, afterwards. And, it was very interesting and very, very powerful experience in this kind of vision. And I just went, okay, there's something in that, even if it's just sort of cultural, there's some sort of cultural indoctrination, or, I look at how popular superhero movies are.
Yeah, right.
There's some sort of resonance for people in these kind of winged figures, or Thor, or these different kind of gods, goddesses, in such a secular time. Maybe it's even more coming to the fore.
Perhaps because it's meeting an unmet primal need. The closest thing I'm going to take to a position at this point is that I feel like consciousness is a spectrum, and that our physical senses are not the only means by which we can verify the whole of existence. So I think it's possible that within that spectrum there are other intelligences that, anybody who's done plant medicine or had an experience like you have likely ends up at some point kind of encountering some non-physical guides or entities. Is it real? I don't know. But it's really transcendental to work with. So that's the premise. That's the premise of pentagram yoga. And although that's just one of the things that I teach, it's certainly not for everybody. It's
and is that in a postural yoga class, like in an asana class, or in a sort of solo practice at home? Give me a sense of how that. I'm curious how that integrates.
Well, it's more like workshop materials. So there would, so I teach people about, how to clear their mind, about setting intention, and then linking that intention with the element that's associated with it. And then, or linking an intention and being able to run it through this, the lens of what's it like if you apply earth or fire, or air, etc. And then I teach them how to do that clearing ritual as I just described. And then it's a guided sequence that is it's asana. Then it kind of brought back to the breath and to the concentration, and so on and so forth. I link. So there's 5 elements, right? I link the 5th element, which is either called spirit or space, depending on your theology. I link that to what's the central channel of the spine, the Sushumna Nadi, and through that then do things like different kind of breath practices like Wim Hof method and handstands and things like this to experience pure open emptiness. It's a lot of fun.
And you're integrating quite a lot of different methodologies here. So there's kind of breath work, hyperventilation, this kind of thing. Then there's the mantras, the asanas. And in a way, it seems almost like getting back to what I hear is historical yoga rather than just the kind of shapes of downwards dog and, forwards bending and things.
I find the way that yoga has changed in studio yoga now to be really unappealing to me. And it's a problem because I still own a yoga school. It's a problem because I have to pay bills. But the thing is that when I started, was it like 18 years ago, right? When I started the school, Yoga Elements, people didn't know what it was. So they were open to everything. I mean, if I had I could have a class on like Indian feng shui. I could have class on whatever, and people would come because they're like, wow, how interesting, yoga, it's everything. Now when people come, they think they know what it is. And because they think they know what it is, and that thing in their mind is basically exercise, that they sort for that pattern, then they look for that thing, chant Om 3 times, let's do downward dog, and chant Om, we're done. And in the end, I don't see a lot of change in people. It's like I see, actually, like the studies show, there's a fair amount of increase in narcissism, like measurably so, with this focus on purely on the body. So I've become a little bit, how to put it, when you have a set of cues within a certain label, like yoga includes certain ways of dress, it includes certain attitudes that we need to cop, it includes chanting Om 3 times, etc., that it kind of ends up switching people off, not turning them off, but it almost like they don't perceive as much as they could if they were more open-minded, if they weren't knowing what to do. So for me, like, I became really interested in, like, how can I use other terms, other maps, and say things that get people into a different, a really full, deep body, mind, and soul experience.
So if people are coming into a studio going, right, this is exercise, and I have to dress a certain way, talk a certain way, look a certain way, and their focus is on that, and then a certain process happens, which may be kind of a nice state shift or some good exercise, but it's kind of limited in a certain way. And then I guess the question for you sounds like, it's like, okay, how do you open people up again?
Yeah, and so right now, I think my entry point is, I realize that pentagram yoga it's not going to kill everybody. What I'm looking at a lot, which is a lot easier to communicate, is breath work, because that, to me, so far has been some of the most profound healing, and it's so far it's delivered what yoga promises to, but doesn't seem to, at least in the 90 minute 1 hour vinyasa class. I'm being a bit snobby, and I know there's and I know there's loads of counterexamples, and I know that yoga, no matter how you do it, is valuable because it puts people in their bodies. I get all that, but I don't know if it delivers emancipation the way it's promised, at least in terms of the word yoga, right?
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest. If we go to a modern postural yoga studio, are you seeing enlightened people? Probably not. Are you seeing people who have become better people? Even this, I would question. Like, I definitely see healthier people and more attractive people. You go to a yoga festival, it's full of hotties, and it's people who look well, their eyes are shiny, their skin's good, they've got energy. But I'm not sure I sort of see more ethical people necessarily, or just.
I don't either.
Why
And
is
I don't. Yeah, I don't know. I don't exactly know how to measure. It's quite analog, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
Although I think Ken Wilber has some interesting ways of looking at that. Like, what he was basing his model, I think, primarily on psychological research from what ended up becoming spiral dynamics. I can't remember the original researcher, but finding that. Yeah, that how people change and become better people. And there's a way of measuring, I guess,
levels of development that we can look at. I mean, Ken Wilber, there's been a bunch of podcasts we've had on levels of development, like Benson Ganti was on, and various other Ken himself and various other people. And so he was looking at, like, does it help you grow? I mean, he'd talk about waking up, growing up, and cleaning up. And there's a couple more, but like, does it help you clean up as in psychologically? No. Does it help you wake up? Well, possibly sort of temporarily. And does it, but not necessarily the state of feeling blissed out in Shavasana. I've seen that last about 5 minutes for most people coming out of a yoga class.
Right.
It doesn't transform from state to trait very easily, the growing up part.
Well, very well put. Why does cleanup come at the end? I didn't quite catch that.
It doesn't necessarily come at the end. They're just what he calls the different categories of personal growth, and says that they're relatively mutually exclusive and need different modalities. So therapy, for example, is one of the sort of working with shadow work, for example, as a cleaning up modality. And they're colloquial terms. He talks about cleaning up. So that's just a colloquial term for working with the unconscious and shadow and repressed material, for example, which is something that I don't see happening in yoga, which is that's shadows.
That's the whole point. I mean, I realize inside myself, like, my own unexamined trauma. I mean, this is sort of a dramatic word, but, like, I mean, we've all been through shit in our lives, and my own experience of not having worked through my own stuff until quite later in life. Well, I guess I'm not sure how Ken Wilber would put it, but essentially, like, I was teaching yoga from that particular stage of development, still at some way, like, imposing my own dogmas that come out of essentially of an injured self. Dressed with a spiritual looking garb. Maybe I'm still doing. I probably still am, but it's a little bit. It's a little clearer than it used to be. So, so you get me. I mean, whether we use the language of pentagrams and angels, etc., or something else, I use that because it's a little bit arresting or shocking, and it helps open up a window where something more can happen. That's basically
And back to the breath work, because it seems to be trending. Like, I'm meeting more people who say they're breath workers, or seeing on their social media it says they're breath workers. And obviously sort of Wim Hof and his technique has been popular. That's been a real trend. And then there's the pranayama techniques, obviously, from yoga. People might be, aware of the kind of different nostril breathing, or, the pumping the abdomen and things like that. I mean, can you say a little bit more about what you mean by breath work, and why do you think that's become popular?
Have you tried it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hosting one of Wim Hof's main teachers in Brighton. And I mean, what in terms of other kinds?
Have you tried? I didn't study. I only took Wim Hof's online course, so I love it. I think it's great, but it doesn't, because the length of time is not. It's not as prolonged as, say, something you do with holotropic or with rebirthing, where something happens, and I can talk about that. Something happens inside that process due to the amount of time that allows shit to release, stuff to release from the psyche. That's that's a conversation right there. So when I say breath work, have you tried something along those lines, along those
Yeah, I mean, you're talking not pranayama now, you're talking like the sort of extended hyperventilation kind of experiences. Like I've only had brief workshop experiences of those, and I didn't hugely enjoy it, if I'm honest, but I know a lot of people got a lot from it. I mean, maybe you could start by saying, what is holotropic breath work? What is rebirthing? Because they're sort of two of the better known ones.
Well, they're quite similar. I cannot comment lucidly on holotropic because it's not my area. Rebirthing, essentially what it is you're laying on your back, and you focus, primarily laying on your back. You focus on a strong, conscious and full inhalation, as much, like all the way up to the top. And as soon as you're finished inhaling, you let it drop with a passive exhalation. And the breath is circular, so it's constant, continuous, and conscious. And when it does, it's not guaranteed, but if the person is able to do this in a prolonged fashion, oftentimes what happens is that the breath somehow gets going on its own. And like in the first maybe 15 or 20 minutes, you have to get the motor running by being deliberately and trying to breathe in that way. And if you can break through, then there's oftentimes the unconscious or the body or what, I don't know, takes over and starts the breathing in a more automatic way. Following that, there's some kind of peak that happens, and I don't know what it is. I mean, it could be the unconscious mind. It could be spirit. If you get into that kind of terms, I do. It's no problem for me. Mm-hmm. It seems to elicit out of the deeper levels of the psyche some kind of memory or felt experience that needs to be processed. Mm-hmm. And it's like a DMT experience. And you could go into it with an intention, but you don't know what you're going to get on the other side. You don't know.
So it's a pretty strong altered state experience from what I can gather.
It's a very strong altered states experience, and it's kind of like reactivating old traumas, but done with consciousness and breath around it. So, intense crying or laughing, tears. You always need a box of tissue.
You always know when this is going on in a festival, because you can hear that sort of from inside the tent is screaming, crying, laughing, and this sort of stuff was very popular in the 70s, and it kind of got a bad reputation, and now it's kind of back. And I'm really curious, like, what's going on with altered states generally? Like, we've had someone on the podcast who does guided tripping, and he helps people through various hallucinogenic experiences, for example.
Yeah, that's great.
You talk about plant medicine, which is a sort of new term for psychedelics and whatever. And it seems like there's books on this, like Stealing Fire, for example, by, is it Kotler? It seems like altered states are really back in a big way. Like society, you could say, wants to get high, or you could say society is really looking maybe for a way out. We find ourselves beset by environmental problems, different crises. People say gender's in crisis, this in crisis. People feel disillusioned when they look at the politicians who are leading their countries. And I'm thinking out loud here. This is really my edge, Adrian. So, feel free to jump in at any point. Like, what is it that we're seeking with this resurgence of altered states?
What do you think it is?
I don't know. Maybe it's looking for new solutions. maybe these things just happen in cycles and we just come back round again, you know?
I would, it's if you live long enough, you start to see that there's really nothing new, and it's appealing to it's appealing at some point to think that we're all waking up. I mean, people banter that phrase around a lot.
Yeah.
The consciousness is growing on the planet, and frankly, I don't I don't really see the evidence of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I run in circles where that kind of term is used a lot. So maybe I'm running into people, and maybe it seems like more people, but the statistics just sort of shows it otherwise. So I don't really, I don't know. It seems like something that's coming around again. As to why it got a bad rep in the 70s. There was one case where, like, if you look up rebirthing, there's one reported death that comes up on this on the scientific website about it, and what that was some psychotherapist was helping this girl. He had created this birth tunnel, I think, with some plastic or some blankets or something, and it wasn't connected breath work. He called it rebirthing, to have her relive her birth.
So is that a separate thing? I've also seen people sort of do these things where they struggle out of sort of fake vaginas, as it were. Is that a separate thing from kind of rebirthing?
Yeah,
as you're talking about it, that's a totally separate.
I don't know. There's a lot of kind of strange stuff. I mean, even the man who started rebirthing, he's quite into immortality as a concept. And if you look at his interviews, he's looking older and older. So,
right.
So you got to wonder if that stuff works, but. I don't know. There's a lot. There's so much of everything now, isn't there?
Yeah, and I sometimes, when I hear like there was a death in a sweat lodge, for example, and it's just someone doing it badly, and that doesn't, discount all sweat lodges. I had a very good experience in a sweat lodge, a Native American teacher in the United States not long ago. But there was this, there's different ways to do them and different levels of skill, and there are risks in, say, using psychedelics. So it's, I think, understanding some of the risks involved. And I'd certainly, anyone doing breath work, I'd certainly say they should get some, be trauma informed, get some training about trauma and hyperarousal and different, these kind of things that might be extremely helpful from a safety point of view.
Agreed. And psychiatrists or psychologists may derive breath work in the following way. They may say that breath workers will open up processes but not close them. Okay. And right. And so in essence, what they're saying is that they are agreeing that it is very powerful, that it is a powerful means to access the unconscious mind. However, it needs a container. And I think that having someone who's trained in psychology or at least some kind of mentoring or coaching process where they can field what comes up for the person going through it is critical.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Okay, so people have these experiences where they're lying down, they're hyperventilating, they're breathing very fast, and they have an altered state. What happens next then in terms of kind of integration or in terms of actually that changing them?
Yeah. So as I experience it, you can take let's say if you have a situation that has many facets to it, it's a particular stuck memory. You can bring up a facet of that through the breath work, and by reliving the experience to some degree, but at this time having breath as the container, conscious, like awareness as the container, it somehow seems to take the charge out of the memory. And with time and with practice, what this does is it really seems to free people up in a way that's more powerful than anything that I personally have experienced. As far as dealing with your stuff, that to me that has been the most effective means that I have found.
I think this brings up a question for me of when people often hear this word powerful, which alternative communities will often almost a bit obsessed with power. Actually, this is the most powerful thing. How does one measure that? Like, how do you know if something's more powerful than something else? I mean, entirely subjective. I mean, how would you know if it had been, inverted commas, powerful for students? Let's say you did one workshop on a Magik thing, one workshop on a breath work, one with just modern postural yoga. How would you judge that?
I would judge it based on the state change and the impact that it makes. You're right about the word use, power. What I mean by calling breathwork powerful, here's why I use that word. It's because like I experienced depression for the first time in my life, and if you know, which is different than being down. It's different than having a bad mood. So I experienced like a really down period in my own life, and I sought out all kinds of ways of getting out of it. So that included psychologists, and of course not every psychologist is the same, coaches, spiritual healers, yoga, of course, meditation, trekking, writing books, etc., and even ayahuasca. And nothing really made a dent in a long-term way for me, except for breath work. And so that's what I mean. It seemed to impact me in a way that other things did not.
Yeah. And this is, to be clear, this is an open inquiry for me. It's something I've been questioning because there's so many different great modalities out there now. It's not to say that modalities don't work. It's to say, like, how do we choose? That seems to be the modern problem. And then if I, as a teacher, people might be reporting that they feel great, for example, after a workshop that I do. Or they might be reporting they feel really bad. But that doesn't see which is the most powerful in terms of actually transforming impact on their life, right? I mean, most of us as teachers aren't tracking students long term. And if we are, like I have mentees who work with me over time, they're self-selecting in a certain way. There's a certain bias to who becomes those students and which students I just don't hear from again after a workshop. And then I've got my own experience, which, something might work great for me or even great for me at a particular time and place in my life, right? And then, I used to get loads out of certain practices. And these days I do them and it just feels like exercise,
That could be why yoga for me is kind of why it didn't work in this case. I don't know how to get around that particular. I mean, what we're looking for is quantifiable ways of measuring change through time, and change fascinates me because it's easy to swing between two pairs of opposites and think that we've changed. Like if I to take just a really simple example, if I need to lose weight or if I need to quit smoking and I quit smoking, and then I go back to smoking, like, did I make a change or did I just, did it, or like if I swing between weight, lose weight, gain weight, etc., did I make a change? So what we're looking for is kind of like what they call in systems theory is a second order change, and in the second order change, kind of everything changes. The viewpoint changes. I don't know. In a lot of ways, I'm still kind of the same asshole as always.
I'm with you on this, Adrian. There's something, if I look at my life and I go, well, there's definitely been some growth for this 20 years of, yoga and martial arts and meditation and, workshops, all the rest of it. And in another way, I haven't changed. In another way, I'm still the same asshole. And
yeah.
what am I pointing to over all this intense work over 20 years? Like, part of me sometimes feel like, yeah, there's definitely been something that I can do or have as a capacity or am that, say, my sister who I grew up with maybe doesn't. And in another way, I think she's done sort of almost none of this kind of work, but is a thoroughly decent human being. And I go,
right.
Like, did she just not need to? Or has her life given her that work? Like, maybe just the struggles of parenting and losing a dad and work and have given her growth. Like, I spoke to a friend yesterday who's done a lot of yoga and meditation, and he says it was his children that have been the big transformative thing for him, And
yeah,
I hear that a lot. It's, I think it's partly cognitive dissonance from parents, but I don't want to upset anyone out there. But it's hard to track, isn't it? And hard to know. So yeah, I'm just kind of incoherently blabbering at this point, but
I don't know that I think about this all the time. And perhaps we need to ask people who've known us for a long time. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe we need to measure in terms of how happy we are. I don't know what the answer is about that. That fascinates me constantly, though, and let me know if you find a way.
It's like, what are the measures, right? Like, you and I are both sober now, drug and alcohol free, then that's a kind of a hard measure. Like, okay, that's a good thing. And it's like, maybe it's like, am I able to maintain healthy relationships? Do I measure it that way and go, okay, well, it seems like that capacity has improved, but maybe it would have improved anyway. Just, you have a few girlfriends, you learn the hard way.
Getting older, right?
Yeah. I mean, just like, am I, for example, I have a pretty healthy relationship. And most people that see us together, and we both self-report high levels of satisfaction, and we're a pleasure to be around each other. And people say, oh, you guys look really healthy and happy together. Is that just that I've done a bunch of relationships? Thanks for the practice, all of those X's. Or has there been some shift in me over that time that's meant that I'm now able to bring, say, more emotional intelligence to that relationship?
I used to think, I remember I was always obsessed with relationships growing up, because I think my own, my parents' divorce, and then I didn't have the best family life. So I was always very intrigued by what factors kept people together, and it was something like, even as a teenager, I would be reading like self-help books and psychology on that, and I would interview people, like interview gay people and straight people and old people, and like, all right, you've been happy for a long time. What was it? I remember one couple, two men, they were like, well, separate bathrooms. That's what keeps them together.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I got into NLP, and I remember there was one exercise which asked us to kind of look at our values around marriage, and I don't even remember what it was now, but it seemed like the light turned on, and I was like, I can do this now. And shortly thereafter, I got married. But then again, as with relationships, it really, you get into that place where your previous imprints from watching your parents and the way you're treated as a kid eventually comes up.
Yeah.
So you got to work through that stuff. But what constitutes change? I've heard it suggested that it takes a strong experience to truly change. Like, it could be a trauma, it could be a religious conversion. So maybe we're back to that strength thing. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's almost too much emphasis put on the strong solo experience. Like, you go to the workshop, you cry, you scream, you have the whatever experience, the vision, the drug experience. And, that's a very strong emphasis on experience as opposed to sort of gradual change over time, like embedding a change, practicing something. They're the sort of, and obviously those tend to interrelate, right? You can have a strong experience which encourages you to practice, for example. I guess there's, Wilber's way is looking at it through developmental levels, which are measurable. And we've sort of skirted around the I and the we and the it, I think. So, I is like, do I report greater levels of happiness, but also I'd say meaning a bit more than happiness? Like that you could track, like I spend more of my day happy than I used to. And then we would be the relational side. Is there general sort of harmony and intimacy in the relationships? And it would be like, do people get more effective? And this is the one that I don't necessarily see in a lot of personal growth communities. Like, if we're really growing as people, shouldn't we be getting like better at running our businesses? Shouldn't we be getting better at the jobs of our life, and not just the feel good or even the relationships? I'm thinking out loud, Adrian. I hope you don't mind. This has become more of a conversation than an interview, but this feels.
Yeah, it seems like we're in similar places. Should we be getting more effective? It appears that a human being has a certain need for achievement and feedback from. A lot of that's based on our perception of money too, though. Maybe those things would be completely irrelevant if we lived in societies without money, or you have enough money and you're satisfied with that amount, then achievement becomes a kind of a different question.
Yeah, and I think that we can subjectively define achievement. It doesn't have to be like given to us by society. Like, achievement for me isn't having a Porsche, for example. But I think it can almost be like a dodge in alternative communities. Do you know what I mean? Like the vast majority of people I know in alternative communities doing yoga, whatever, if you said, look, would you rather be financially rich or poor? They would say financially rich. Or they'd say, I'd want 20% more income. Some would say, no, I'm completely happy how I am. But there's a way in which it feels sort of a dishonest kind of dodge, not all the time, but a lot of the time, when people say they don't have the values of a sort of materialistic society. I go, really? If you were to just be able to press a magic button now and get it, wouldn't you?
Yeah. That the dodge, you mean like they're kind of, they're pretending in some way
I don't need money, Adrian. I'm beyond money. I'm too spiritual for money. And it's like, well, actually, you'd rather have money than not, right? So that is included in your definition of success, whether you admit it or not. If you'd rather have it than not, like you'd rather have health than not, you'd rather have a good relationship than not, probably.
I guess it depends on how motivated one is towards it as an outcome. I mean, you said definition of success being a Ferrari. I know somebody who that was actually a Lamborghini, but for him, that is absolutely everything. And once he thinks that once he has that will be absolute vindication of everything, all his way of being, his entire life.
He's gonna have a rough day the next day, huh?
Why? When you nick it or something, or no?
When he gets when I steal his car. Adrian, must be thinking of me.
All right, Mark. Yeah.
I was thinking, he's going to get that car at some point. Most people do get what they want in the long term. I notice. He's going to work hard and make some money, and maybe after a few false starts, he might get that car. And then the next day, he's going to wake up, and is he going to be completely vindicated?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if you have a fancy car like that, you need an expensive garage. You need a home. There's a lot of other auxiliary things in order. I mean, the car, So, anyways, yeah, those are good questions. Those are good questions about change. I can't answer them. I do know that I spend more time feeling good than I used to. And I also catch myself if I'm heading down negative thought patterns. I can kind of catch myself a lot faster than I used to, and pull and steer the ship in a different direction. And I do attribute that to breath work. Probably meditation may has done similar things for me in the past. So
sometimes it's those little signs, isn't it? Like I have a particular problem right now I don't want to get into online, but it's a little personal problem. And I texted someone today and said, hey, can I just pull this interview? I said, hey, can you give me some help on this? And I thought to myself, I would have never done that 10 years ago.
Why not?
Well, I wouldn't have been able to reach out for help. That's a skill I've developed. That's not a skill I was taught socially as a young British man, when in need, reach out for help. No, I was taught, tough it through and pretend it's not a problem and this. And there was just a little sense of like, oh, that's good. That's like this sense of a small win, some sort of new capacity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And it's also, I mean, there's probably peers of yours who still wouldn't do it, right?
Oh, for sure. Some of my best friends would find that an unimaginable thing to do, to say, hey, I'm not great in this way. Can you help me with this? Maybe we can have a conversation. Like they would roll over and die before they reached out to people who love them, let alone, strangers, professionals.
So did that feel kind of wussy or sort of like, I don't know, too feminine or something? Are you okay?
That's what I'm saying. It felt invincible. It was like, okay, if your car's broken, you call a mechanic, right? It just felt totally normal. But what I'm saying is that maybe one way we see growth is in these new behaviors that feel healthy. Yep. I'm just using that as a minor example, but it was like a little moment of like, there's a positive new behavior there. And I think that's something I've learned or have learned through my own hard work. That's not something that was given to me.
Yeah. I in my own growth and experience, it is a little bit. I like I said, I used to live in my head, and I probably still do. But I think what I was very, very good at it, and I created very elaborate theories and models about how the world worked, and in doing so, I think that it provided me a way of not thinking that I wouldn't get hurt. Mm-hmm. So if I could just have enough like theory about something, I would remain at a distance from it, and in doing so, then everything's fine because it's just a theory, and so that all works to build power, but it's not very good for building intimacy. So it's funny now when I see people who are very in that way, I can spot them, and I know exactly what it's like, and I feel a little bit sorry because it seems that I don't know if this is true, but if you want to crack the head open, some kind of something that it'll have to happen. They'll bring you to your knees. It could be a really strong sense of love or infatuation or religious experience or trauma. For me, it was divorce, and that that blew open my that blew the frameworks out, and I found a kind of a shift in the way that you're talking about, but it's in multiple ways. Like I relate better to people now because of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we do need those powerful experiences to hit rock bottom, or for some people to sort of be blown open with love or whatever it is. Okay, Adrian, this is fun. I feel like we could just keep chatting for another couple of hours, but I need to head out. So to move towards wrap up, where can people find you? What's the best place to find you online?
Yeah, so yoga studio in Bangkok is yogaelements.com, and that's the easy place to find me. And then I'm doing work in Europe and Asia, so that's kind of thing. And if actually Facebook is probably the best. Adrian Cox, easy place to find me. So feel free to connect with me through there.
Great. Well, thank you very much for your time today. Much appreciated.
It was a pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much.
some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/embodiment podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodifacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. If most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodifacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodifacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook. There, bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.